These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. Last time we looked in great detail at the first 2 years of Assurnasirpal's reign. And I was thinking, that's a whole lot of slaughtering and traveling and slaughtering more people. Maybe we should take a break from all the killing and take a look at the city of Calhu before moving on. But as exhausting as it is to keep up with our favorite psychopath tyrant, we have 2 more years before we can really get to the new capital city in our narrative. Basically, I was thinking about my favorite history podcast, Dominic Perry's History of Egypt podcast. Not sponsored, but go check it out. It's pretty great. And he'll go on and on for sometimes hours about the architectural and artistic and archaeological details of the tombs and cities of ancient Egypt. And that stuff is fascinating. I wish I had the depth of expertise to approximate at least some of that here. But I usually can't, which is why I don't try. To each his own. Anyway, the point is that these descriptions are often a little bit bloodless, which is fine. He's an expert, and archaeology is a serious subject deserving of serious detail. And yet the city of Calhu is not a bloodless affair. We've already in the last episode seen that every one of his conquests in the first 2 years has slaves and treasure directed towards the king's great ambition. And now we have 2 more years to cover before the city receives its inaugural feast. 2 more years that will come at an extremely high cost for the victims of Assyrian expansion. And so we'll cover the city of Calhu in some detail here at the end, but it is important, it is exciting, but we can't skip over the blood and anguish upon which the city was built. All of which brings us neatly back to the year 882, somewhere in perhaps the middle of summer. Now, the army had started the year with a bloody suppression in the northern mountains, and it may be that this campaign, or the army's experience more generally, pointed to a logistical deficiency in the region. To be sure, this is a region of logistical difficulties, and we'll rarely see the Assyrians at their strongest in the Anatolian highlands without great strain. But it seems that at least some could be done here to mitigate the issue. And so the king headed a bit west from the heartland, possibly east from where he was. We're not quite sure where he started this journey, if it picks up right at the end of the previous campaign, or if he went back home and then started this again. But it's to this point here along the northern Tigris River where Shalmaneser had 3 centuries previously identified a particular strategic site for logistics and fortification. Now this town had long been abandoned, but Assurnasirpal now brings his army, which remember is full of conscripts at the moment, so it's basically interchangeable with his labor force, and he envisions a new life for this town. Now this town is not Calhu, but Tushha, and it will turn into one of the most important strategic centers on the northern frontier for the life of the empire. Now the king ordered a survey of the land, cleared out all the rubble, and had all the foundations redug and began construction on a pretty significant fortress town. Most significantly, he isn't just building a fort, he centers the fort around a palace complex for the king himself, with white limestone statues of himself and his deeds. Now this serves Assurnasirpal's vanity, of course, but it also allows the Assyrian king to reside up north and handle business more easily, while also projecting Assyrian cultural power into otherwise poorly held territory. Though the region around here has just been depopulated, shall we say, by the recent rebellion, there are still plenty more people to pick from, it seems. The king notes that not only are there various people of the Nimrud tribes living around here, these are the ones who had just rebelled, but haven't all been totally slaughtered, and in fact it seems they can be collected, gathered, and planted in his palace like a gardener would rearrange the flowers in his garden. But it also seems there's a bunch of Assyrians who have been living in the general region for quite some time, who he generously invites into this new city. Again, we get the question here of what exactly is an Assyrian at this early stage of history. These people have, it seems, been living in the region for maybe a few centuries at this point, and the king describes them as being of generally miserable condition, hiding in caves from famine and enemies, though some of this is definitely a poeticism to enhance his perceived benevolence. But how can the king identify the Assyrians in these mountains from the Nimrud, Aramaeans, or other ethnic groups? You might think something to do with language, maybe something to do with blood ties, kin groups, social relations, maybe something to do with religious practice, maybe. The truth is, it's far from clear. Every one of those explanations I just offered has real issues in defining what an Assyrian is at this early period. It may have been a combination of things. It may have been self-identification, or it may have been something that we're just completely missing. This text, at least, does nothing to tell us who an Assyrian is, just tells us that there were Assyrians here at this point. Whatever the ethnic issue, Assurnasirpal sits himself down in Tushha for at least a few months as all this construction gets started. The most important works get done promptly: the establishment of large strategic granaries and treasuries, generously filled by the neighbors who are quite eager to have very high taxes levied upon them. Assurnasirpal tells us proudly that he raised taxes in the region higher than they'd ever been before in history, both in material terms and in terms of corvée labor. And also he enslaved all the sons of the nobles as palace servants and hostages. It's great fun. He's very proud of all these things. Tushha is to be a newly incorporated district of Assyria, but all the lands around it are the now fairly well-conquered tributaries which we've seen the previous 4 kings wage war against. And so the king is able to pretty much just demand tribute, and then it gets handed over to him without too much fuss being noted, because he's got this big old power center right in the middle of all these people. The king seems to have taken a bit of a break at this point, focusing himself for an unclear number of months on constructing the city and pacifying the general area. And he seems to have had quite a nice time of it. I imagine it was rather like playing a city-building video game, except, in real life and with unimaginable levels of authority, and all the atrocities are inflicted on actual people instead of video game characters. At some point, however, he decided to come down from his northern fortress to go harass some Aramaeans and Neo-Hittites over on the west edge of the Calah region. However, just as he was leaving, the people of the land around Mount Kashiari had heard that he was leaving, and so they decided that right now was the perfect time to stop working on the new city of Tushha, run off into the mountains, hole up in a mountain fortress, and declare independence from Assyria. Sometimes we all make bad choices. So before the army had even made it down the mountains, the king had them all turn around and assault the fortress where they were all holed up. Blood flowed like torrents, captives and possessions were carried away, all of the surrendered fighters had their heads chopped off, and the skulls were used to construct a tower, and all adolescents were thrown into a huge fire and burned alive. Floods of blood sound like a poeticism, and probably also a heavy metal band name, but we have no real reason to think that the Tower of Skulls and the Bonfire of Teens were not actually literal events. That is to say, they probably happened. The level of creativity on display would horrify the most foul demons of most folklore and fantasy realms, and this is all just what actual historical humans did to other actual historical humans because they weren't getting along during a construction project. Anyway, after this, Assurnasirpal gets back to his original purpose and conquers land from some Habhu people on the west side of the Khabur region. He is, note here, slowly working his way west. He does seem to have a plan to reach the Levant even this early on, but he's taking his time, methodically conquering and annexing one region at a time. He returns home for the year with plunder and celebrates the new year somewhere in the Assyrian heartland. We don't really know well where. As the new year dawns in the spring of 880, it seems to me that our tireless tyrant was planning to focus mostly on construction for the year. He still has major logistical lifting to do for his new city of Tushha, and the city of Calhu is well underway as well. At the same time, projects in at least Ashur and Nineveh have been started. He would take credit for a remarkable amount of construction across the empire during his quarter century as king. And while we don't know how much of it has started just yet, we're in year 3 or 4 of his reign, he does seem to have had at least a lot of it in mind already by this point. But during the year, he receives a report that a fellow named Nur-Adad has rebelled in the Iranian mountains and disrupted a tribute shipment due to the great gods. Ashur himself requires that the king mobilize the army, and so a war under holy auspices is launched, which heads east into the Zagros Mountains. A pitched battle is met in a certain mountain pass. The rebels were likely hoping that they could contain the greater numbers of the Assyrian troops, but it turns out yet again that the Assyrians were not only more numerous than their foes, they were higher quality soldiers as well, and about 1,500 enemy soldiers were slain in battle, suggesting the total army may have been around 5 to maybe even 10,000 men in total, with even more men on the Assyrian side. This was therefore likely a fairly large battle, funneled through a fairly tight mountain pass. And while we have no details on the battle itself, it was likely quite hard fought. But once victory was achieved, captives and plunder were rounded up from a large number of nearby towns and villages. The towns were really probably mostly villages. And then the army continued to pursue the fleeing rebel army. Another battle was fought where Assyria claimed another 1,200 casualties, and that seems to have been the end of that rebellion. On his way back, though, Assurnasirpal realized that he had a massive army just, standing around. So he didn't go back home the straight, direct way. Instead, he went through the city of Bara in the Iranian mountains and decided to conquer them for no particular reason. Now, this wasn't a huge town, only 300 soldiers killed and another 300 taken captive, but he brought home some light plunder from it. The king himself seems to have set up for a certain period, maybe a few weeks, in a palace district around Bara, or in one of the other major towns nearby, and he administered government for a little bit. But by the end of the planting season, he called another round of conscription and logistics to support a winter campaign in the same area. It's not clear if this is him following up on the summer rebellion, or if he was just deciding to conquer even more land in the Zagros Mountains. But either way, the fighting is fairly methodical and straightforward, though the king himself does twice claim to have managed to assault up a mountain personally, yet again, amidst one of the battles. The first time that he single-handedly did all of it, it resulted in slaughter and plunder. The second one of these ended with heads hung from trees and youths being tossed in bonfires. He then returned to camp and spent the night, apparently sleeping soundly following each adventure, the way a proper hero should, who has nothing wrong on their conscience. When he woke up from his peaceful sleep, he decided that he would have the army pitch a more permanent camp, which they would use as their base of operations for the remainder of the year. From this base, he decided to conquer all the land of Zamua, which was dominated by four main capital cities, Bara, Lar-Brusu, Dur-Lulumu, and Bunisu, which collectively ruled over 150 settlements in the area. The already weakened enemy put up very little resistance. The greatest army that could be mustered in defense of Zamua amounted to all of 50 men, who were summarily defeated, and in a round of slaughtering, capturing, pillaging, burning, and destroying, followed the battle until all the leaders in the region had submitted and given tribute of goods and labor. That labor, of course, went right to Calhu. Finally, at the end of the year, he headed back to Nineveh, but on the way, he paused at the town of Berutu, which had supported Nur-Adad back in that summer rebellion, and he burned the town to the ground, just to be thorough. Now, the year of 880 opens pretty uneventfully. The king hangs out in the Assyrian heartland, presumably directing his many construction efforts as well as distributing plunder around the major noble houses. He's not resting. I find it hard to think that he ever sleeps, given how much he manages to accomplish each year. But in early summer, a report arrived that two lords who had submitted just last year, two guys named Ameka and Arashtua, had refused to offer tribute in this year as well. They seem to have thought that maybe the whole being conquered, therefore tax and tribute thing was like a one-time thing or something. Well, Assurnasirpal assembled an educational expedition to inform them of the fact that it wasn't actually a one-time thing. In fact, Assurnasirpal was so eager to educate these wayward subjects that he advanced up the lower Zab River without even waiting for the muster of troops to be completed. Keep that in mind. He's only got his bodyguard. The main army is still assembling behind him. With only his bodyguard, which, to be fair, I say only, it likely numbered in the low thousands at this point, he entered the mountains and started going town to town in the Dagara region, demanding tribute. Once he reached the city of Amali, they assaulted it the very first morning they arrived and destroyed all resistance, about 800 soldiers worth. He took the dead soldiers and used their blood to paint the houses of the town red, while the town was systematically ransacked for captives and plunder. Nearby towns were then plundered, and the whole throwing adolescent children alive into a bonfire thing was again attempted, since it had proven educational in the past. He says of the region, as he marched his army away, that the former mountain cities had been turned into hills of ruin. But all that was just one of the two education opportunities for the wayward students. The other one, a Mecca of the Zamu, the folks who give the Zamua region its name, fled before the Assyrian army even reached their capital, which seems to have spared the city itself from the brunt of Assurnasirpal's wrath. Only plundering of the palace was undertaken as they entered without resistance. Emeka himself had fled to a fortress across a river atop the mountain Itinu. However, when the Assyrian army arrived there, it turned out that the rebel king had fled from Itinu as well, so the fortress was plundered without resistance. They chased Emeka further east across another river, and were able to catch up with him in a mountain pass, where a pitched battle was fought. The battle was an Assyrian victory, but the army was slowed enough for Emeka to shut himself away in the nearby fort atop Mount Elaniu. However, as the Assyrian army approached this mountain fastness, the king again fled. The fort surrendered without a fight, was plundered, and the army continued in dogged pursuit. Emeka then climbed up Mount Sabua, but the Assyrian king was sick to death of this nonsensical chase, and so instead of assaulting yet another mountain, he put his soldiers at a distance away from the fort, placing ambushes all around the main routes in and out of the mountain. Meanwhile, the rest of the army set off to plunder the towns of the region, which again get turned into hills of ruin with a notable lack of gentleness. The gambit ultimately pays off, as Emeka apparently believes he can escape once again while the Assyrian army is distracted, only to get ambushed in a clearing. He and 50 of his men are killed, and their heads are hung from a tree back in Emeka's former capital city of Zamru. The return trip to Zamru finally gave the mustered chariots and militia time to catch up to the king, which tells us how fast he's been moving through all this up till now. And now the much larger army finds itself in the middle of the Zagros Mountains with a fresh set of reinforcements, and yet they have no clear objective. They were supposed to hunt down the rebels, and Assurnasirpal had already done that before the army showed up to help him. So Assurnasirpal decides to go further into the mountains than any Assyrian king had ever gone before, and attacks town after town. He declares his intent to start marching eastward, and the first place he arrives, a modest kingdom around Mount Nispi, resists and gets destroyed, while the nearby region of Sipirmena, where the men apparently do their hair in what the Assyrians considered an effeminate fashion, preemptively sent a nice cartload of tribute to avoid a similar fate. As the army moved deeper into the mountains, they had to dig with iron axes to clear out the road before them to allow for chariots and logistics wagons, and the people of this deeper land mostly submitted, though one group fled instead and were hunted down and slaughtered. Following the slaughter, their bodies were deposited in a row from Mount Simiaki to the river Turnat. How far is that? I have no idea, but it's a row of bodies from one place to another place. It doesn't really have to be that long to be impressive. Anyway, the captives, both those who had submitted and those who were forced to submit, they were all sent to Calhu for the ongoing efforts there. And as he traveled around the land of Zamua, we hear that Assurnasirpal encountered the ruins of a town called At-Lila, which some Babylonian king named Sabir had founded back in the past. We don't know of a king called Sabir, but we do have the name of one Simbar-Shippak, who interestingly ruled over Babylon in the Dark Age around 950 BCE. If the two are the same, which isn't certain but has been proposed, then this would either suggest that the Babylonians were doing some astonishing conquering during their hardest period, which seems rather unlikely, or that this Simbar-Shippak was a conquering warlord from the eastern mountains who took over this town as well as Babylon at some point in his career. Now, the mystery of Sibir's conquest of Attila is one of those fascinating glimpses of what was probably a grand and storied career now wholly lost to us. But it doesn't really matter, since Assurnasirpal refounds the city as Dur-Assur, or Fort Assur, and makes it into a logistical and military outpost deep in the mountains. And this ends his campaign for the year. He plays builder there in Dur-Assur for a few months, then he heads back home. His focus at this point is now fully on the new city of Calhu. But building a city from nothing is harder than it might seem. So while the builders build, he heads out in early summer with the army to go on a relatively peaceful tribute tour. Relatively speaking, compared to most of his activities. He heads north up the Tigris to lands which have been bullied many times before, beginning in Katmuhu and moving northwards. The lands which offer up gifts freely are passed by peacefully, and the lands which resist are beaten back. Matiatu sends an army of 2,800 men, which accomplished them nothing but captivity, mass resettlement, and many years of extra stringent taxes. The king erected a massive statue of himself in the town to help them remember who was in charge, and then he moved on. We hear about the town of Assyria. The whole record of that town is, I pitched camp, I spent the night in the city of Assyria, I burnt Assyria, I retrieved tribute from the city Suru in the city Assyria, and then he moved on. Madaranazu resisted and was destroyed. The passes of Mount Kashiari resisted and were hewn away with iron axes. Yes, he does describe mountain passes as resistant in very similar language to how he describes people rebelling against him being resistant, because he's a megalomaniac and absolutely insane. Up in the Nairi lands, the city of Madara closed their gates and hid behind high walls. However, after being besieged for a bit, they surrendered, but rather too late to spare them, and they came to a bad end. Between Kashiari and the new city of Tushha, he found occasion to despoil 60 villages. But after Tushha, he encountered the fortified city of Petura. Assurnasirpal tells us that this city was exceptionally difficult and took multiple days of assaults to breach, only falling when the king himself transformed into the divine avatar of Adad, the storm god of devastation, taking on the holy form of a storm bird to fly against the enemy troops. Of the surviving soldiers, some were taken captive, the rest were thrown alive on a bonfire. A pile of live men, as well as some presumably not alive heads, were constructed out of 700 men impaled upon stakes, forming some sort of tower of the dying, ornamented by heads frozen in death. Then, and only then, did he destroy the city and turn it into a hill of ruin. Then he lit the youths on fire. The whole tribute tour thing is basically forgotten at this point. I was skipping over the peaceful segments of the tribute tour, but they've become less and less frequent as this listing goes on. In a blood-mad rampage, he attacks town after town in the lands in and around Habhu territory, inciting battle after battle, slaying 700 men here, 1,000 men there. The captive soldiers get their arms hacked off, and his royal radiance becomes an almost divine weapon, ruining the enemy before his weapons get a chance to. Captives by the thousands are recorded, and huge quantities of grain and supplies are delivered to the strategic granaries of Tushha. As the year wraps up, the king finally starts to calm down and receives word that one of his vassals, Ame Baali, was slain in a domestic revolt, And so he brings the army over to wherever Ameba'ali was from and puts the rebels down with the sword. The city surrenders without much of a fight and hands over fantastic quantities of wealth. At which point, all that blood and slavery and brutality finally pays off. Assurnasirpal leads his army back home to the Assyrian Triangle, but not just to the 3 cities of the Triangle, Ashur, Nineveh, and Arbail. No, this time he goes right to the center of the triangle, not far from where the greater Zab forks off from the Tigris, entering along a newly constructed canal to feed his newly constructed city. This, finally, is Calhu, city of slaves constructed entirely of bloody plunder and mud brick. It's a grand city, even at this early phase of development. But realize that we're only about 5 years into his reign. And it's taken us 2 episodes to get through it all. All this tireless effort has all been dedicated to this one massive project. I mean, it's been empire building as well. But it really seems that his focus in all of this was building up the labor force and the plunder pile necessary for this one huge project. The amount of human suffering involved in any ancient construction town is just astonishing to modern eyes. But Calhu was a town at this point wholly consisting of captives and their Assyrian overseers. It was, it seems, a perfect vision of Assurnasirpal's wishes for the entire universe. Now, spiritually, the town was founded around a massive temple of Ninurta. In, by now, standard fashion, the ziggurat which anchored the temple was a cube of 120 cubits on either side, which is remarkably close to exactly 60 meters by 60 meters by 60 meters. The ziggurat was situated on the citadel, a raised plateau in the northwest corner of town, from which vantage point the rest of the city could be looked down upon. The ziggurat itself was the northwest corner of this northwest corner, symbolically the citadel of the citadel. A sprawling structure at the base was either an extension of the ziggurat dedicated to Ninurta, or it was another semi-attached temple dedicated to Ninurta. It's unclear how the temple and ziggurat were ritually connected, despite a fair amount of speculation. Ninurta, though clearly the primary deity of the city, was not the only god to be highly honored. Adjoining the Ninurta temple was one dedicated to Shara-Nephi, a variant of the more well-known goddess Ishtar. Adjoining that was a temple to Gula, goddess of healing, and adjoining that was a branch temple of the Kidmuru, which was initially an Ishtar temple in Nineveh, but which seems to have founded its own, franchise temple out in Calhu. Interesting stuff. Didn't know temples had franchises. Anyway, Adad and Ea the king and the moon god Sin also all had shrines within the northwest complex, which have all been identified. The whole complex was founded on a foundation, which we are told was perhaps 20 to 30 meters deep and filled in wholly with baked brick. So the entire enterprise was absolutely massive. Elsewhere on the citadel, in worship structures separate from that one, we're told that Nabu, Enlil, Shala, Damkina, and the Sabiti, the 7 warriors of Nergal, were also honored. We do know where Nabu's temple was. It's a freestanding structure on the east end of the citadel, but I can't find that archaeology has verified the locations of the other shrines. We just know about them from text. Just south of the complex was the Grand Palace, which was not quite as tall as the temples, but occupied about twice the square footage. Now, this wasn't likely completed yet. Indeed, the temples probably weren't fully operational here in year 5 either. But they both formed the core of the city and were quite clearly livable after only a few years of construction. Statues and reliefs were still under construction, but likely a few pieces were already on display. Of course, the distinctive lamassu were in place. They were sacred guardians needed for ritual protection. And here we see the distinctive artistic trick of doing the legs so that if you see them from the front, they appear to be standing at attention, but if you see them from the side, they appear to be striding forward. The human and divine statues, meanwhile, mostly stand at attention, constructed of fine stone imported from the mountains where Assurnasirpal and his predecessors had been conquering. The use of fine stone is going to be one of the hallmarks of Assyrian royal art, and as is the tendency to use an increasing amount of 3D in the sculpture work. By which I mean, up to this point, reliefs have been the dominant Mesopotamian carved art form, mostly two-dimensional representations with just a bit of depth carved out. However, Assyrian statuary is going to be carving deeper and deeper into those reliefs, to the point that at least some of them are nearly freestanding on two sides. Full statues are also getting carved better and better. The precision is higher, and while many stylized elements are retained, there's more life even in these often stereotyped images than was previously common. What in earlier periods would have been classed as exceptional workmanship is becoming more often the standard under Neo-Assyrian patronage. The ones actually doing all this work, however, are nowhere to be found atop the citadel of the city. To the south and the east, the terrain falls about 15 meters to a low, flat plain, bounded on the west and south by the Pati-Hegali Canal, meaning something like the River of Bringing Abundance, which Shalmaneser I had originally dug a few centuries ago, but which Assurnasirpal's slaves, conscripts, and Sabu deportees have redug and extended. This canal feeds a lavish garden there in the lowlands, with peaceful meadows bounded by orchards bearing all sorts of fruits, and rendered cool with fine shade trees. Cedar, cypress, ebony, junipers, oaks, and tamarisks of multiple sorts are planted around almond, date, olive, pomegranate, pear, quince, fig, and swamp apple trees, with grapevines interwoven through the branches. Many more sorts of trees as well, whose translations we're not sure of. Assurnasirpal paints a word picture of himself strolling through this garden, picking fruits and reclining like an image of earthly paradise. Near the garden was a zoo featuring wild bulls, ostriches, lions, elephants, and my favorite, monkeys. The canal also supplies the ordinary people who live on the main plain of the city. We hear that the people of the lower town were from everywhere in the world, or at least everywhere in the world that the Assyrian army had ever reached. The people in the lower city weren't living in an unusual amount of squalor. The poor parts of every ancient city were pretty wretched by modern standards, but we don't have reason to think that the regular folks of Calhu had it any worse than their equivalents over in Nineveh, Babylon, or any other major city. We know relatively little about them as a class, however, as archaeological excavations have mostly focused on the northwest citadel and the southwest so-called armory. There are no southwest armories or palaces just yet. Those are going to get added in under the next king and then built up later. But it makes sense for archaeologists to focus on the palaces and temples, since those have proven to be an absolute gold mine for significant texts in the massive libraries which later kings would found in the city. Now, all of this originally caused the excavators of the city in the late 1800s and early 1900s to wonder if this was the city that had once been home to the famous Tower of Babel. You have palaces full of hunting scenes because every ancient Assyrian king loved to show off his hunting. You have a city full of many different ethnicities, and the crown of the city is one of the famous ziggurats, rising high above the citadel and likely visible from most parts of the city and for a distance on the horizon. It's because of this early misidentification with Babel that the archaeological site of Calhu soon got the name of Nimrud, on the assumption that this was the city of the biblical Nimrod. Oddly enough, even though we now know the name of the actual city, Wikipedia and many news outlets still refer to the place as Nimrud. But to be clear, the archaeological dig site is called Nimrud in a lot of popular literature, but the ancient city was always Calhu, and it actually shows up in the Bible under the Hebrew version of the name Calhu, which is Calah. So you have all three names showing up in various documents, all three sometimes used by both popular and academic sources, because it's just kind of a mess. That's fine. But Calhu will cease to be the capital of Assyria around 722 BCE, a good 150 years after its founding, and the city will be destroyed by invading forces a century later, at which point it was basically abandoned and never resettled, already seemingly a ruin by the time Xenophon passed through in the 5th century BCE. From that point on, it lay in the sand until occasional visits in the early modern period transformed into full-scale excavations in the earliest days of archaeology. Being the earliest days of archaeology, they didn't always know what exactly they were looking at, as mentioned with the whole Nimrud confusion, but they generally seem to have done their best, and the Nimrud expeditions are not known for the same level of mismanagement, pillaging, and general foolishness that you hear about from some other early archaeological sites. Work continued on and off for a century, and Nimrud became a model archaeological site, yielding massive quantities of valuable texts, many of which we're depending on in these episodes, and undergoing extensive reconstruction to allow for what appears to have been an absolutely fantastic tourist site. You'd just love to visit it. But you can't. Because in 2014 CE, that is only 10 years ago, the Islamic State took over northern Iraq. Spokesmen for the Islamic State pointed out that the example set by the Prophet Muhammad when he took over formerly pagan sites such as Mecca was to initiate a campaign of wanton destruction, and cited numerous Quranic verses and hadiths where Allah and the Prophet urged all Muslims to destroy polytheist structures, polytheist property, polytheist heritage, and polytheist lives. Now, there were no polytheists living in the area. The modern Assyrians are all largely Christian, and so they just settled for bulldozing the entire site, 90% of which was destroyed between 2014 and 2015. There was no military, diplomatic, strategic, logistical, or productive value in this act. It was a religious act, prompted wholly by the Islamic State's commitment to following the commands of the Islamic holy texts and the example of their Prophet Muhammad. I could go into more of that, into the genocides of 1915, the genocides of 1933, the Islamic State campaigns into Khabur in the Assyrian heartland in 2014 and 2015, which also turned into genocides, but I don't want to. I may put an extended meditation on genocide up over on my other channel, Christ in Questions, if you're interested in theology, philosophy, and how it intersects with history. You should go check out that channel on YouTube, Spotify, or any podcast something something. But honestly, the whole thing is pretty taxing to research and consider. I may or may not actually get around to discussing it, even on the other channel, because it's miserable. So instead, we're going to leave all that there. And next time, we're going to get back to the ancient history, where the atrocities are far enough away in time that we can consider them a bit more neutrally, and sometimes with a bit of levity. Instead, join us next time as we pause our narrative and take a deep look at the early Neo-Assyrian army, before the great transition of the late Neo-Assyrian period, but after the great transition of the Bronze Age collapse. What made this early army so effective? How did it operate? And how might people of the time have perceived the military might of the Assyrian Empire? It'll be a lot of fun. Our sources are thin for this particular topic at this early stage, but they're often highly suggestive. Thank you for listening.